Greetings, everybody. It's a beautiful day in North Texas. Today's topic, today's video, is going to be over nursery stock standards. And this has to do with the grading of ornamental plant material. You are probably somewhat familiar with the concept of grading plant material, especially if you've ever gone to the store to shop for apples. If you were to look closely at the sticker on the apples that you were buying in the grocery store, you would see that there would be an actual apple grade assigned to that particular product. Now, I'm not an expert on apple grades and apple sizes, but my understanding based on what I see in this diagram that I grabbed from the internet is that there are 3 different grades of apples. The lowest grade would be US Extra Fancy, and then a grade above that would be Extra Fancy #1, and then the best grade would be the Fancy Premium, or excuse me, Extra Fancy Premium apples. So I'm assuming that those 3 grades of apples have to do with the quality of the fruit itself, the appearance of the fruit, whether there's any blemishes on the fruit, or whether the color is good. In addition to the grade, there's also a size category assigned to the apples, and I'm assuming that's going to be based upon the diameter of the apple, and I'm also assuming that that would be measured kind of at the widest part of the apple. So for example, if you look at the diagram, you can see that there are small, medium, and large sizes of apples that you can purchase. So it looks like with apples, you get a grade classification or category, and then a size classification and category as well. So what about ornamental plant material? All right, let me see if I can stop sharing this. All right, so you might be able to see me briefly here. And I'm going to try to get to my PowerPoint. All right, hopefully you can all see this. So the title of today's presentation is Nursery Stock Standards. And in the nursery business, all the nursery stock standards, or that is to say, all the different grades that we assign to the different categories of nursery stock are going to be found in a document called the American Standard for Nursery Stock. This document is something that you can find online, or you can also buy a printed copy of this document as well. Why do we grade plants? A couple of different reasons. Number one is the definition of grading. So the process of assigning a size/quality class to a plant is called grading. And we did the same thing with apples that we just saw a bit earlier. Grading is a standardized system of sizing and describing all types of plant material. And really the bottom line is grading helps facilitate the buying and selling of nursery stock. So in other words, if you're a landscaper and you want to buy a 2.5-inch caliper tree, for example, you want to know that the nursery is going to sell you a 2.5-inch caliper tree. So if the nursery, the grower, is using the guidelines, then you as a buyer have some indication that you're getting what you think you're getting. So the American Standard for Nursery Stock has grading scales for all of the following different nursery commodities. So you can find grading scales for deciduous shade and flowering trees, for shrubs, for roses, for small fruits, even for lining out stock. This document, the American Standard for Nursery Stock, has very specific grading standards for a variety of different plant material. What follows in this presentation is really just an overview of grading standards, and we'll be focusing on ornamental trees and shrubs. Let's begin by taking a look at deciduous, shade, and flowering trees. So if you remember back to our presentation on nursery commodities, this was one nursery commodity. So these are trees. They are either going to be deciduous trees, they're all going to be flowering trees, although some of these flowering trees, like southern magnolia, would have outstanding flowers, and it would be an example of a broadleaf evergreen. So when we grade deciduous, shade, and flowering trees, they are going to be graded by something called trunk caliper. And what is caliper? Caliper is essentially the diameter of the tree, and it's going to be measured in inches. So the next question is, where do we measure the trunk caliper or diameter? I mean, do we measure it 6 feet above the ground? Do we measure it right at ground level? Well, for most trees that we grow in the nursery, we're going to take the measurement 6 inches above the ground. But for trees that are large caliper trees, we're going to be taking that measurement 12 inches above the ground. And let me explain to you why that is. Look at this picture of a tree. You can see that as trees get older, they develop something called basal trunk flare, where the bottom of the trunk flares out. This is a very normal and natural condition, but when we measure the caliper of the tree, we don't really want to include that trunk flare in our measurement because it actually distorts the size of the tree. So on larger caliper trees, and that would be trees larger than the 4-inch diameter class, we are going to be taking the measurement 12 inches above the ground to compensate for root flare. But let me tell you this, in my experience in the nursery business, for a nursery to grow a tree to the 4-inch caliper or diameter size class is going to take, many years. It may take 5, 6, 7, 8 years for the tree to get that large. And in my experience, most nurseries are not going to hang on to the tree for that long. They're going to want to sell that tree before it gets that big in size. So for all practical purposes, for most trees that you find in nurseries, the measurement is going to be made 6 inches above the ground. It's only those larger trees where we take the measurement 12 inches above the ground. Okay, this is an example of the grading scale for deciduous, shade, and flowering trees. If you look at the scale, you can see that it starts with 1/4 inch, then moves to 1/2 inch, 3/4 of an inch, then 1 inch, 1 1/4, 1 1/2, and 3/4 of an inch. When we get to the 2-inch diameter or caliper, then we jump to 1/2 inch increments. So it goes from 2 to 2 1/2 to 3 to 3 1/2 to 4 to 4 1/2, 5, 5 1/2. And then when we get to the 6-inch caliper or diameter, then we go every inch. 6 inches, 7 inches, 8 inches, 9 inches, and so on. So what you're looking at is the grading scale for deciduous, shade, and flowering trees. So let me ask you this. Let's say, for example, that it's your job to go out and measure the caliper of a certain tree that a landscaper wants to purchase from the nursery. So you go out with your calipers, and I'll show you a picture of calipers in just a second, and you measure a tree, and according to the calipers, it says that that tree, 6 inches above the ground, has a caliper or diameter of 2.9 inches. So what grade do we assign the tree? If you look at the grades, 2.9 inches is less than 3 inches, so we cannot assign that tree to the 3-inch grade because it is simply not large enough in diameter. It does not make 3 inches, but it does make 2.5 inches because 2.5 inches is 2.5 inches, and we said the tree that we measured was 2.9 inches. So we would have to assign the tree to the 2.5 inch grade. That's how the tree would be graded. These are examples of calipers, and you can purchase these from different horticultural supply stores. And basically you can open them up and place them around the trunk of the tree. And of course you would be doing this for most trees at a point 6 inches above the ground. And then there's a scale that you can read the diameter of the tree off of. And let me show you where that is. See if I can use my pen here. So the scale is right here, probably a little bit hard for you to see. This is another tool that will measure a trunk caliper. The advantage to this particular tool is that it has a long handle, so you don't have to bend over or crouch down, to find that 6-inch mark above the soil level where you would take your measurement. This is a different way of measuring trunk caliper or diameter. This is called a diameter tape. So when you look at this picture, you may say, whoa, it looks like what they're really measuring here is the circumference. And that's true. They are measuring the circumference, but the tape is graduated in such a way that the reading that you get off the tape is actually a reading of diameter and not circumference. Circumference would be the distance around the trunk, and we don't care about that for the purposes of grading. We're interested in knowing the diameter, and there is a tape like this. It's called a trunk caliper tape or a diameter tape, and it's graduated in such a way that the reading you get will be the diameter of the tree. You're looking at a picture of two different trees, so let's look at the one on the left. Now, this one happens to be an example of a balled and burlap tree that was dug out of the nursery. And you can see kind of down here where it says caliper, so we're going to be measuring caliper 6 inches, above the ground. So caliper is, one way of grading the tree, but in the nursery stock standards, there are also minimum heights that the different grades need to be. And I'll show you an example of the grading scale that I actually took from the standards that shows you the different heights that the different trunk calipers need to be. All right, here's that table I was talking about. And let me see if I can change colors here somehow. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this for a second. So let's go ahead and go down, just for the sake of example, to the 2-inch caliper. So if you can see that on the table, that's right here. So this is an actual table from the American Standard for Nursery Stock. And this is saying that if you're going to sell a tree as a 2-inch caliper tree, that it requires a certain minimum height, and that height is 8 feet. So the tree has to be 2 inches in caliper or diameter, and it's got to be a minimum of 8 feet tall. Its typical maximum height for that size tree would be about 12 feet. Okay, here's some interesting information. So this is saying that if you're going to sell this tree as a balled and burlap tree that you're going to dig out of the nursery field, this table is telling us that the tree should have a minimum root ball diameter of 24 inches. And that the depth of the root ball should be about 14 3/8 of an inch deep. Okay, this table is also telling us that if we're growing the tree in a container, that a 2-inch tree should be in a number 20, a number 25, or a number 45 containers. So those are really big containers. If the tree is going to be grown in a in-ground fabric bag, and this is another production style that is used at some nurseries across the United States. And this is telling us that the acceptable diameter, or the minimum diameter for that in-ground fabric bag, is 16 inches. So there's all sorts of information that you can get by looking at the standards for nursery stock. All right, let's go ahead and talk about trees with multiple stems. So you may ask, well, what trees would have multiple stems? And, the classic answer to that would be something like birch. Many trees naturally grow with multiple stems, although there are ways that we can create multiple stems in the nursery as part of the production process. So not all trees have one single stem. Some trees are multi-stemmed trees. Okay, trees with multiple stems are graded by height. Okay, so this is different. We just saw that with the deciduous shade and flowering trees, those were graded by caliper or diameter, but these multi-stem trees are graded by height. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. These trees can also go by different names. Some people refer to trees like this as being clump form or shrub form trees. Okay, there are many different genera of plants that naturally produce trees that grow with this kind of habit, but we can create these trees in the nursery. So we could take a tree, theoretically, that would normally grow with a single stem. So the tree that comes to mind, one tree that I saw on a walk this morning was Bradford pear, or another way to say that would be ornamental pear. A ornamental pear is a tree that typically would grow with just a single, straight trunk. So how could we take a tree that wants to grow with a single straight trunk like this, and how could we turn it into a multiple stem tree or a shrub form tree? Well, what we could do is, if we had the trees, growing in the nursery. So let's say here's a young tree, here's the root system down in the soil, and here's a couple leaves on the tree. All right, and let's say that when this tree was maybe a year or two old, we came by and we cut it way down here close to the ground. So what do you think is going to happen if we did that to the tree? Well, what's going to happen is the following spring, the tree is going to produce numerous side branches from buds that are going to form on this little stub here. So the following spring, the tree might look something like this. All right, so now what I've done is I've taken a tree that had a single stem, and because of the way that I pruned it in the nursery, I've turned it into a multi-stem tree. So this is one way that I can make a single stem tree a multi-stem tree. Let me show you another way that I can do it. So let me see if I can figure out how to erase my, whoops, I want to go to draw, use my eraser. Yep, hang on a second here. I'm gonna get this here. Well, doesn't seem like I can figure out how to erase this, but we'll just kind of draw above it. Let me see if I can. So another way that we could make a multi-stem tree is I could take a container so here's a container or a pot, and I could either grow myself or purchase from another nursery liners. So let's say that I want to grow a multi-stemmed birch tree. I could purchase liners of young birch seedlings, and I could plant maybe 3 or 4 of them together in a pot. So here's 1, here's 2, here's 3, here's 4. So there are 4 plants potted in the same pot. And there's some leaves, okay? All right, so when I take this pot out to the field, and I wouldn't do this for maybe a year or 2, so I would let these seedlings grow, at least for one growing season, so that they were well established in this pot. And then I would take this pot out to the field and I would plant it in the field. So when I plant it, I'm going to end up with a clump, of 4 stems, 4 birch trees that are going to be relatively close together. So this is how I can create a clump form or a shrub form tree. According to the standards, this diagram shows the different precise definitions for multi-stem, clump form, and shrub form. But in my experience in the nursery business, sometimes all 3 of these terms kind of get used together. To a lot of people, they all mean the same thing. But according to the publishers of the Nursery Stock standards, they are different things. So you can see on the left the picture of a multi-stemmed tree which shares a single root system. So I'm thinking that this could perhaps be a tree species that just naturally sends up many shoots and becomes multi-stemmed on its own. Okay, what you see in the center is an example of a clump form. So this kind of lines up pretty well with the example that I just drew of taking maybe 3 or 4 seedlings and growing them in one container. So when you plant that container in the field, you end up with 3 or 4 individual plants that all have their own trunks and their own root systems. So that would be clump form. And then shrub form, well, shrub form is kind of more lines up with the example of growing a plant in the field and then cutting it back very hard in the fall and then letting it throw out multiple shoots the following spring. So that's how you could create a shrub form tree. But like I just said, a lot of nurseries kind of use these 3 terms interchangeably. Right, here's a picture of heritage river birch. Heritage is a cultivar of river birch. And you can see in the picture that it looks like there are four seedlings of heritage that are planted into each of these pots. So here's the grading scale for the multi-stem trees. And we said that multi-stem trees are graded by height, not by caliper. So again, looking at this grading scale, if we had a multi-stem tree and it measured 7 feet 2 inches tall, the question is, what grade will we put it in? Well, it's not big enough to be considered an 8-foot because it has to at least measure 8 feet to be assigned that grade. So if it's 7 feet 2 inches tall, it would be graded as a 7-foot shrub. Here are some of the different ways that we could measure plant height. Now, the examples, the pictures that I'm showing you are not of multi-stem trees. These happen to be evergreens, but you get the idea. So, people just kind of use whatever they have, or they may make their own measuring stick to take out into the field with them. So if the picture you're looking at top left, you're just basically looking at a person holding a ruler, a yardstick up against a tree so that you can get an idea of its height. But if you're talking about an 8 or a 10 or a 12-foot tall multi-stem tree, you're going to need more than just a yardstick. You're going to need a good size grading scale that may go all the way up to maybe 16, 18, 20 feet tall. So you can see this guy is holding this grading scale up against this coniferous evergreen tree. And just by looking at it, it looks like it would probably, it looks like it just barely gets to 7 feet. So to be fair, I would probably grade that particular tree or evergreen as a 6-footer because it just barely makes 7 feet. Okay, here's the grading scale for the multiple stemmed or multi-stemmed trees. And again, there's all sorts of information that we can glean by looking at this table. So let's go ahead and pretend that we're looking at something that is going to be in the 8-foot grade. So that's right here. Okay, so the next column to the right says the minimum ball diameter, and then the next one over says minimum ball diameter. Well, the question is, why are there two columns that tell you what the minimum ball diameter should be? And basically what we're saying is, or what the standards are telling us, is that if the multi-stem tree has a narrow or upright habit, where the width is no more than 1/2 the height at maturity, that you're going to use these minimum ball diameters right here in this column. On the other hand, if the multi-stem tree is broad, has a broad or spreading habit, then we're going to be using this set of minimum ball diameters. And then over here, so these are the different container sizes that you would grow an 8-foot multi-stem tree in. So again, just to reiterate, when we talk about the ball diameter, what we're saying is for an 8-foot multi-stem tree, so 8 foot would be the grade, and if we're looking at a tree that has a narrow habit, and I'll show you a picture of a tree that has a narrow growth habit in just a second. We're saying that a tree like that would have a minimum ball diameter of 28 inches. So when you dig the tree, See if I can draw this over here for you. So you're going to be digging the tree out around balled and burlap. So here's the soil ball, and the tree is going to be kind of growing up out of that soil ball. And in this example, the tree has a very upright growth habit. So what we're saying is that if the tree is in the 8-foot grade, and if it's a narrow or upright habit, then we are going to put a 28-inch ball diameter. So what we mean by ball diameter is the distance from here to here. Okay, that is the ball diameter, and the minimum is 28 inches, so it can be larger than that. So why do we care about these minimum ball diameters? Well, we care about them because, you know, when we dig a tree, a balled and burlap out of the field, we want to make sure that we're capturing enough of the root system so that the tree will survive in the landscape after it's transplanted. So if we took an 8-foot tree and put a 12-inch diameter ball on it, well, we're going to cut and lose a lot of the root system with only a 12-inch diameter ball. The larger the tree is, the greater the diameter of the root ball needs to be in order to kind of capture more of the root system so the tree can survive in the landscape when we transplant it. All right, so this is an example of a tree that has a very narrow upright growth habit. So this is pyramidal European hornbeam, and it just naturally grows like this. This is how it grows. It's got a very, very narrow or upright growth habit. This is an example of a tree that has a broad or spreading growth habit. Okay, so far we know that if we're talking about deciduous shade trees or flowering trees, that those are going to be graded by caliper or stem diameter. If we're talking about multi-stem trees, those are going to be graded by height. So that's what we know so far. Now let's go ahead and move on to deciduous shrubs. Talk about those. So we take shrubs, and to simplify the grading system a little bit, we're just going to break the shrubs down into two basic types. We're going to either call them small or dwarf shrubs. That's one type, or we're going to call them intermediate to large shrubs. That would be the other type. Okay, so the small or dwarf shrubs, now here's the important thing to remember. They can be graded by height or spread, whichever happens to be greater. So what do we mean by spread? All right, let me grab my pen for you again. So let's say we have a shrub. So this is the ground, okay? And let's say we have a shrub that kind of wants to grow like this. All right, and so here would be the branching structure inside the shrub. All right, and then of course the roots would grow down into the soil. So if you're grading a shrub like this, well, obviously this shrub grows wider than it does tall. And this particular shrub would be graded by spread. All right, what do we mean by spread? So spread is this dimension going this direction. That's what we mean by spread. So if a particular species, a particular cultivar of shrub grows wider than it does tall, then we're going to be grading it by its spread. If it grows taller than wide, so let me show you another picture here. So there's the ground again, and now let's say we have a shrub that kind of grows like this. And there's the branching structure in there. So this particular shrub grows taller than it does wide. And this one would be graded by its height. So height would be this dimension right here, up and down. So for the small or dwarf shrubs, if they grow wider than tall, then we're going to be grading them by their spread, or another way to say that is we're going to be grading their width. And if they grow taller than they do wide, then we're going to be grading them by their height. And the grading scale is shown right here. So we've got 6 inches, 9, 12, 15, 18, 24, and 30 inches, and then so on. Crimson ruby Japanese barberry would be an example of a small or dwarf shrub. I mean, what you see in the picture, that's as big as this particular plant gets. So again, if it's a plant that grows wider than it does tall, we're going to be grading it by its spread. The intermediate to large shrubs, those are going to be graded by their height. And you can see the grading scale there. Okay, so here's the table from the standards that show the different grades for the tall, large deciduous shrubs. So if we have a shrub that's in the 4-foot grade, it's supposed to have a certain minimum number of canes or stems, which is 6, and it would have a minimum root ball diameter of 20 inches, a minimum root ball depth of 12 inches, and if you were going to grow it in a container to the 4-foot grade, you probably would want to use a number 7, a number 10, or a number 15 container. And if you were using a in-ground fabric bag, that bag should have a minimum diameter of 12 inches. If you're familiar with Goldfinger potentilla, this would be an example of an intermediate size shrub. A waxy leaf privet would be an example of a large shrub. So the intermediate and large shrubs are going to be graded by their height. Coniferous evergreens. They come in a variety of shapes and sizes, and they are going to be graded either by their spread or by their height. And again, it's going to depend upon the habit of that particular cultivar or species, how it naturally wants to grow. That will determine whether it's going to be graded by spread or height. Let me show you some examples. Wow, so this is blue chip juniper. So blue chip juniper, kind of considered a ground cover by a lot of people, only gets maybe 6 to 8 inches tall, but it can spread to be several feet wide. So this would be a great example of an evergreen that would be graded by its spread. Okay, and the measurement that you take should be the average spread, not the greatest spread. So let me illustrate what we mean by that. So let's pretend that you're a bird flying over this plant, okay? So here's the center of the plant right here, and then the plant kind of radiates out from the center. kind of like that. Okay. So you're flying over the plant. This would be the very center of the plant right there in the middle where that dot is. So when they say that the measurement should be average spread, not greatest spread, well, I mean, greatest spread would be from here to here. So that's going to give you a pretty large grade. So what they're saying is the measurement should be average. It shouldn't be the minimum spread, but it shouldn't be the greatest spread either. It should kind of be an average spread. Okay, and then here's some grades from the standards that you can look at to kind of see minimum ball diameters and whatnot. So I'm not sure how well you can see that. There's a lot of information there. Okay, moving on to the next group of evergreens. So these are the semi-spreading evergreens. And these are graded by spread. So the picture that we just showed here is dense U. So dense U falls into this semi-spreading evergreen class, and it would be graded by its spread. This one is a juniper called sea green juniper, and it would also be graded by its spread rather than its height. So there are the specific specifications in this table. All right, there are many evergreens that are going to grow taller in height than in spread, and these would be graded by their height. So let me give you some examples. Mugo pine would be graded by height. Globe arborvitae, so you can see that the plant naturally wants to grow taller than wide, so it would be graded by its height rather than by its spread. The same with Black Hills spruce. So Black Hills spruce, when they're young, they have a very conical shape. So a little bit wider at the bottom, and then they taper to a very nice tip. Looks like the perfect Christmas tree, right? So these would be graded by their height because obviously they want to grow taller than they do wide. These are some Chinese junipers. They would be graded by height. So in order to grade a plant, it's interesting, you really have to be able to identify what that particular plant is. If you don't know the species or cultivar that you're grading, then you may not be able to assign it to the correct grade because you won't be sure which is the correct table to use. One other thing I'll say about grading plants is it seems like there are a lot of rules and regulations, and there are, but the fact of the matter is that people that do this for a living, people that grade plants in the field for nurseries, they get to be pretty good at it, and they get to be pretty fast at it. So they don't, spend a lot of time, they don't measure from the ground up 6 inches to measure caliper. They just kind of know where that 6-inch mark is going to be. And a lot of times they can just look at a shrub and tell you immediately what its grade is going to be based upon its height without even using a measuring stick. So they just get, used to doing the work, and assigning grades to plants is something that goes pretty quickly. The other important thing to remember is that grades are not only useful for the buying and selling of plants, but grades are also useful in what's called the nursery inventory. So we inventoried our nursery, and I worked for a nursery in Northern Illinois, And every year we would inventory or count every single plant that was growing on that 400-acre nursery. And we would have to, know what species, what cultivar we were talking about, and then we would have to grade it. So we knew how many of each of the different grades of plants we had growing in the field, because we would have customers calling it, and they would want to know, hey, do you have a 3-inch caliper red sunset maple available? So we would have our inventory computerized, and we could look it up and determine whether we indeed had that size, and then where in the nursery you could find that particular tree. So grading is essential to maintaining a nursery's inventory besides facilitating the buying and selling of nursery stock. Broadleaf evergreens, things like southern magnolia, boxwood, they would be examples of broadleaf evergreens. They're going to be graded essentially just like the evergreens are. The spreading types are going to be graded by spread. The taller growing cultivars and species are going to be graded by height. And plants that are grown in containers. So when you're talking about container grown plants, specifications for container grown nursery stock shall include a container class specification in addition to the plant size specification. So what does this mean? This means that when you're selling container grown nursery stock, you need to be able to tell the buyer what size container the plant is in and what grade the plant is. So really two pieces of information. Okay, there are exceptions for certain herbaceous perennials, ornamental grasses, ground covers, and vines. One last thing I'll say about the standards is, they are recommendations. They are the recommended way that we grade nursery stock in the United States of America. And most nurseries faithfully attempt to use them to the best of their ability. But not everybody has to use them. So you have a choice as to whether you want to follow them or not. But because they're so commonplace across the country, most nurseries choose to use the standards. All right, so this is a table that came from the nursery standards, and this is telling us something about how big different containers should be. Now, there's been a lot of discussion over the years about containers, and when I started out in the nursery business, they used to sell containers based on, well, they called them like a 1-gallon container or a 2-gallon container or a 3-gallon container. And to this day, you will still hear people using those terms, but the industry is trying to move away from that, because what we found is that a 1-gallon container didn't necessarily hold 1 gallon of potting medium, because there were so many different manufacturers that were making the containers. One manufacturer's 1-gallon container might be slightly bigger than a different manufacturer's 1-gallon container. So the industry has attempted to standardize container sizes, and they would call on what we used to call a 1-gallon, they call it a number 1. So that's right here on the table, a number 1 container. And they're saying that to be a number 1 container, it has to hold somewhere between 152 to 251 cubic inches of medium. And this column over here expresses that volume in cubic centimeters. Okay, so in order to be a number 1 container, you have to be able to hold or have to have a certain volume to be classified as a number 1 container. So that's what this table is telling us. And then up here you see SP. What does SP stand for? It just simply stands for what they call small pots. So we have an SP1, SP2, SP3, and these are, very small pots that we would use. Maybe we might take a liner and put it in an SP2 and then grow it for a year and then bump it up to an SP4 and grow it for another year and then maybe bump it up to a #1 container and then possibly sell it. So we use smaller containers in the production process to kind of take small liners and grow them into bigger plants. So that's what that's all about. All right, so that brings us to the end of our presentation. Let me stop sharing here. And see if I can close that. Okay, so I think you guys probably can see me. So that was a lot of information on nursery stock standards and the process of grading nursery stock. So hopefully you didn't find that too boring or too dry. It is kind of a drier topic, but it is something that everybody needs to know a little bit about. So that is all I have for you guys. And thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.